Usually, when I talk about my book and about nationalism, I do a kind of a description of OUN nationalism from 1929 to 1956. So those are the years that are covered in my book, and I talk a little bit about the politics, the ideology, and the literature, because I'm one of the few people that actually has read the literature produced by the main writers who were fans of the OUN and who developed the myth structures that were very basic to the OUN nationalist thinking. But I've been thinking more and more about OUN, and one of the things that has begun to puzzle me, and something that I've been thinking about a lot more recently, is the fact that although scholars are reaching a consensus about the OUN, as they are about many things to do with the Second World War and events that immediately followed, the general public often has gone in a different direction, and the myth-making that exists in the general public is sometimes very divorced from what the scholars are writing and thinking. So this has stimulated me to think about cultural memory, how institutions, art, literature changes, reconfigures memory, and how memory acts differently, appears differently in the present to what the realities were in the past. So that's been, that's the inspiration for this particular talk. And I want to show you a little bit about contemporary memory. Well, first of all, there's a controversy. This is a hot topic, an issue that has become very, very contentious. And you probably know all these facts, but I'll just remind you a little bit about them. The Hero of Ukraine Award was given to Bandera by President Yushchenko in 2012, then promptly revoked by the incoming president Yanukovych. Svoboda party, which controlled the Lviv Council, then had a regional award, which they gave to Bandera. Pietrovich's book, the Second Polish-Ukrainian War, appeared, very controversial book. It has now gone through a Polish edition, and an English edition is being prepared. There's massive coverage occurred during the Maidan of the right sector and Svoboda. Then, as you know, all sorts of statues are going up to the leaders of OUN, particularly Shkandrij, Bandera, and most recently the Polish Sejm, the parliament, has passed a resolution or declaration stating that the events in Volhynia in 1943 were a genocide against the Polish population. 90 Ukrainian intellectuals signed a letter saying that they wanted 2 events to be created commemorating the treatment by Poles of Ukrainians. And now we have a film, Volhynia, produced about the events of '43 in Poland, which has been banned in Ukraine. So this is a really hot topic, and one that you know, people are thinking about. In the summer of 2015, I was interested in this. So when I went to Ukraine, I interviewed various people. Here you have the names of a whole series of intellectuals and writers, from Leonid Finberg to Yevhen Zakharov, the human rights activist in Kharkiv, to Zhadan, Serhii Zhadan, to Olena Stiazhkina, who is the rector or president of Donbass University, which has now been moved to Vinnytsia, but she's also still helping students from the Donbass, from Donetsk. Then Oksana Zabuzhko, Yevhen Holovakha, who is a leading sociologist, one of the people who works in the Ukrainian embassy in Ottawa, Marko Shevchenko, and Yaroslav Hrytsak. I asked them all, how do they look at Ukrainian nationalism? And I was a little surprised because this is what they all said. First thing they all said, well, it's totally marginal. First of all, they thought I was speaking exclusively about Svoboda and right sector. It didn't even occur to them that nationalism could be outside that very small group, and they identified it as marginal. They talked about Ukrainian nationalism, especially this marginal sector, this far right, as ideologically silent. That's a phrase by Hrytsak. In other words, they don't really say what they're thinking. Their ideology is hidden, it's murky, it's incoherent. That's from Zhadan. Or it's barbaric. That came from both Zhadan and Finberg. And other people said it's not a threat. These people are a very minor group. But it could be a threat after the war because they could mobilize. They have a dictatorship is in their blood. You know, they're looking for control. The other things that they said was it's not the same as European nationalism. We don't have the same anti-immigrant philosophy. Almost everybody said it was a product of Russian informational warfare, Russian special operations. So it had been prepared. The far right had been given lots of airtime on the Ukrainian TV, radio, because they were trying to set up this straw man which Yanukovych could then defeat in an election. So it had all been prepared. And the last thing that they often talked about was the mentality of paternalism, which kind of feeds into the support base of the people that really are pro-nationalist. So I was surprised, and I kind of began exploring this a bit. And in my book, I noticed that there was a big division between what people were saying on the ground. These intellectuals were saying one thing. A lot of ordinary people are saying something quite different. The people who are putting up monuments are saying they're glorifying the OUN as an armed struggle. I had actually read as many of the ideologists, as many of the political theorists, and as many of the literary figures as I could get my hands on it. Now, I had a different view of what that movement was about in the 30s and 40s. And I'm not going to try and summarize my book, but I'll give you some of the main points from the book. First of all, it's important to remember, we often forget because we are now far from this period, but this was a minority group. It was not, even in Galicia, even in Hrytsak, it was a small group. Most people voted for the UNDO. Most people were Democrats. Most people supported a parliamentary system. These people, the OUN people, were not. Their membership was relatively small. Even in 1939, roughly about 9,000 members. Secondly, its political character. It's important to say clearly what they were. They were anti-democrats. They were opposed to parliamentary systems. They were totalitarians. It's in their program. They were totalitarian. And they were extremely sectarian. In other words, they said, we are the one and only leadership of the national liberation struggle. Everybody else has to join us. It's a sectarian mentality. They were violent. They included assassinations, robbery, arsons, intimidation in their tactics. If you read the literature from the 1930s, they would go to punch the faces of editors to intimidate people. We're talking Gilo editors, people who they felt, these young men in their own felt, were not patriotic enough because they were not supporting the particular party. They had lots of trouble with the church. They were denounced for their assassinations by Shevchenko and others. They were preparing the population for militant action for revolution. Then I read the ideologists. I'm amazed. People really don't analyze these, but nobody even knows who they are. But this was a group of ideologists who developed OUN's ideology, who wrote among themselves, who wrote articles, who debated, who were in contact with Konovalets, Yevhen Konovalets, the leader of OUN in the 30s. And they published many articles in the journals that they controlled, and that ideology went through an evolution. It's actually more interesting than people give it credit for. So, Mykola Styborsky, Dmitro Andreevsky, Volodymyr Martinets, Yevhen Onatsky. Onatsky lived in Rome. Yulian Vassyan, who was imprisoned for most of the 30s. And there were 7 leading writers who are now being rediscovered in Ukraine, often misinterpreted. Very little is said about their contacts with OUN. They weren't all members of OUN. Some were very close to OUN. Most of them broke with OUN, and that's never talked about in contemporary Ukraine. Most of them broke with Dontsov and OUN during the war, or immediately at the end of the war. And they are Yevhen Malanyuk, Olena Teliha. She remained pro-OUN to the end. Leonid Mosens, Yuri Lipa, Oleg Olzhich, who was the youngest of the ideologists as well in OUN, Yuri Klen, Ulas Samchuk. So I analyzed these writers, and I've got chapters on them in the book. But I also discovered when I was working on these that there's a myth system. And often the myth system is easier to detect. It's better viewed through the literature and the art. What was the fundamental myth system of that period, and particularly of the OUN writers? Well, first of all, palingenesis, this idea of the rebirth of ancient characteristics. A restorative regeneration will occur through violence, through violent revolution. And so you have all these references to the greatness of the past, the Cossack past, the Kievan Rus, the time when we were powerful, we were strong, we were feared, we were a nation that was cohesive. You also have repeated personal and political transformation. Everybody, not everybody, but many of the characters in the books go through a conversion experience. Suddenly they discover that they are Ukrainians. Suddenly they discover the need to join the movement and become politically active. This was not simply a literary trope. This actually happened. Olena Teliha began as a great Russian imperialist, chauvinist, as she says in her own writings. And she went through a conversion experience in Prague. Leonid Mosens began as a great Russian chauvinist, as he says himself, and he went through a conversion experience after reading Hrushevsky one day. So these are the kind of myths. And the third one, Rome. Rome representing cult of force, cult of power, the cult of strength. These are the kinds of myths embedded in the literature. So that's something about the realities of the OUN. Another thing that I feel that I have projected, I was going to say discovered, but maybe that's too strong a word, something that I have put forward, which I think is a useful way of looking at nationalism in the 30s and 40s, is to distinguish 3 kinds of nationalism. There are many kinds of nationalism, but there are 3 currents that I suggest people can look at. First of all, there are the National Democrats. Most Ukrainians belong to this current. They supported the struggle for civil rights, the struggle for cultural and political rights, the struggle for the Ukrainian language, with the ultimate goal either of an independent state or, in Galicia, for autonomy, for more powers for Ukrainians. After all, the Allies, after the First World War, and Poland had promised Ukrainians in Galicia a form of autonomy, which they had reneged upon. And Ukrainians in Galicia always fought to have that, that instated. That's a very different kind of nationalism. It's more evolutionary. It is more concerned with winning battles in the press for public opinion. The OUN's type of nationalism, sometimes called authoritarian, sometimes called integral, really felt antagonistic to those nationalists. They were for political revolution. For an independent Ukrainian state that would include all Ukrainian lands, the way they defined Ukrainian, which meant in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in Romania, in one state. And to throw out the occupiers, defined differently in different contexts. But that was the OUN's type of nationalism. And there's a third. And this is where I part company with many people who have studied or thought about OUN. I think Dontsov was a different phenomenon, far more radical. Dontsov was unapologetically pro-fascist, pro-dictatorship. He never said anything against Hitler or Mussolini. He admired all dictators. But most important, he didn't really have a political program. What he had was a program to change the psychology of Ukrainians. His writings are vehement, full of intolerance. He asked for people to overstep the bounds of morality, to break with previous moral rules and regulations. That's a very different kind of approach from the OUN. I would say that, in fact, if you read the literature, the OUN leaders had a lot of trouble with Dontsov. They tried to steer him, they tried to control him, they never succeeded. But they were afraid of the kind of influence that Dontsov had, not so much on the intelligentsia, the intellectuals of OUN in the West, but on young Galician Ukrainians, the young hotheads, as I sometimes call them, in Galicia, who idolized, worshipped Dontsov. And it is not to the credit of the OUN leadership that they did not rein in Dontsov, although some of their ideologists, like Styborsky, like Yevhen Onatsky, argued with Konovalich that they should fight Dontsov, they should confront Dontsov, and they were prepared to do so. That was nixed. What was the OUN's attitude towards these hot-button issues, like, for example, Nazism and racism? Well, they were influenced very strongly by Dontsov and by Vysnik, the journal personal journal of Dontsov. It was his personal publication. He owned it. He wrote many of the articles under various pseudonyms, and he had a small group of writers who supported him. Between 1937 and 1941, this particular journal, and to some degree OUN itself, went on a particularly racist and anti-Semitic turn. So they moved in those years into sort of Dontsov's sphere, especially the young people in Galicia. You can read Yaroslav Stichko's statements in various newspapers from this period, particularly one that was published under a pseudonym, but a well-known pseudonym, in a Canadian newspaper, which I reprint in my book. I found, but totally, well, not totally by accident, a friend of mine who knows the archives of Oseredok in Winnipeg told me that the transcripts of the radio broadcasts that OUN with German support and German permission made from Bratislava and Vienna. Those transcripts are available, and they are in Osredok Library archive. So I went through them. There are many, many nasty anti-Semitic and semi-racist, I'm using anti-Semitic in the sense of anti-Jewish, racist comments. And they sort of, that period from 38 to 39 was the high point of that anti-Semitism. But it tailed off at the end, and suddenly it stopped. I'm not quite sure why. If you want evidence, you can find it there. And then, of course, there are things that are often talked about, like the April-May instructions that the OUN issued on the eve of the German invasion. They had things to say there about Poles, Jews, and so on. And, of course, the big issues now that are being investigated by Polish, German, Western scholars. What happened in 41, the pogroms when the Germans invaded? Was OUN involved? How was it involved? Who was involved? And 1943, the Volhynia tragedy. So we know all that. But here's the more difficult problem. How do you square that with these issues? Early in the 30s, OUN leaders, those people living in Paris and Berlin and Rome and Prague, distanced themselves from Nazism, refused to cut ties with established churches, rejected racial theory. And if you read the writers, that's the internal discussion and the discussion in the press took place. It's there. For obvious reasons, they challenged Hitler's view of Lebensraum. I mean, Hitler wanted to make this a German colony, Ukraine a German colony. They clearly were not, for obvious reasons, were not interested in that. They also had read Mein Kampf, and internally they circulated those paragraphs translated into Ukrainian of Mein Kampf, which dealt with Ukraine, with information about what is going on in Germany. They, if you read the articles of Onatsky from Rome, Styborsky, Martinez, there's clearly anti-racist, anti-Nazi discussions going on there. And there's internal correspondence that people actually wrote to Konovalych and said, why are you publishing, why did this anti-Semitic article appear in your journal? You know, they were upset. So there's a internal discussion going on, which is not the same as some of these statements that came later, particularly 38, 39. And of course, we have another issue. After 43, the OUN, the Banderites dropped all this to pro-totalitarian, pro-German rhetoric and began to change. So we have to bear that in mind as well. So today we have this situation where Ukrainians are, because of the war, because of Maidan, are beginning to idolize militant action. And they're looking for a tradition. They're looking for a past that they can claim as their own. So Oksana Zabuzhko writes this novel, and it's all about unearthing things, finding things in the earth that have been buried, relics of the past, and going into photographs, checking out photographs, finding out what really happened in UPA, what really happened during the war, what were those bunkers really like. Patriots fighting the war, women as well involved in fighting the war. It's a new kind of myth-making. It's a reshaping of the cultural memory. So if you read cultural memory studies today, it's worthwhile thinking about these things. Cultural memory can be multi-directional. It can include many competing narratives that eventually get integrated, but which struggle with one another. Memories interact. They're not always the same. But the experience of war and the experience of analyzing the details, the personal histories of war, opens up a possibility for new kinds of discussions, degrees of responsibility, degrees of guilt, how you can be both a victim and a perpetrator. These are the kind of discussions that are going on in the German discourse about the war. How you can have empathy and or sympathy or understanding. Empathy is when you identify with a character. Sympathy is when you don't identify with that character, but you, from the outside, you can understand, you try to understand, you try to have some sympathy for that character. These are the kind of things that are important, I think, for the new cultural memory studies that is happening. But we have some issues. Not everybody's going to agree with this, but I did read and look very closely at Volodymyr Vyatrovich's book on the Second Polish War. He's a very important figure in the current struggle to shape Ukrainian cultural memory. He was actually hired for the Institute of National Memory, and I think part of his job was to create a sympathetic picture of the national liberation struggle, and the OUN in particular. So he was also head of the archives of the secret police, the SBU, and he was able to find various materials. He created a narrative in which the OUN become heroes. Second revised edition appeared shortly after the first. Then a Polish edition has appeared. Now an English edition is being organized. What are the issues? What are the main issues that have caused people to get very upset with Vyatrovich? First of all, the issue of equivalence. In the Volhynia tragedy, or the Volhynia killings of 1943, he says basically it was a war. Roughly the same number of people died on one side as the other. That has been violently contested, particularly by the Poles, but by many other scholars as well. Secondly, he conflates the national liberation struggle with the OUN, right? It's like they're synonyms. Every time he talks about the national liberation struggle, he's actually talking about the Banderivtsi. There is no other national liberation struggle. There are no nuances here. There are no other nationalisms. The Banderites are it. One party, one leader, one national liberation struggle. Thirdly, there's absolutely no discussion of the Holocaust. This is important because many people have argued that those policemen and members of the militia, the people who were OUN-be, people who sent into the militia and then into the police, defected, went into the underground, became the nucleus of the UPA. They had learned how mass killing occurs because they had witnessed, maybe even participated in the Holocaust in Volhynia. They used those same techniques against the Poles in 1943. The argument is that this happened. Why can't you talk about it? Why is there no discussion of it? Another big issue is the decision was taken by the OUN-be and the UPA to detonate that massacre of the Poles. Well, Vyatrovich, if you read him carefully, comes very close to agreeing with that. But what he says is that it was Dmytro Klyachkivsky, Klem Savur Dmytro Klyachkivsky, the leader of the Volhynian UPA, who did it on his own without getting permission from the OUN center. So he's actually arguing that maybe the decision was taken. We know for sure that the UPA OUN did not revoke that decision. It went along with it afterwards in any case. Victimhood, Ukrainians are always portrayed as victims, but never as no recognition of Ukrainian guilt, the degree to which Ukrainians were perpetrators. He argues, and here I tend to agree with him, the ethnic cleansing, whether you can call it a genocide, I'm not quite sure. I don't think that's, I think that's a strong term. Certainly it was ethnic cleansing. And Vyatrovic, if you read him carefully, pretty much says that. But he raises good arguments as to why it should not be called a genocide. And of course, now we have the struggle over cultural memory. So very briefly going through this. And here I want to draw your attention to the fact that cultural memory influences our views of the OUN today. Most of us grew up in diaspora, as they call it in Ukraine. We're an emigre community, and we have assimilated certain images, certain ways of thinking about the struggle in Ukraine, the UPA, the OUN. This man, this is the most famous graphic artist from the underground, Neil Khasevich, and you have this sort of sense of a war, portrayed as a war. The Ukrainian national liberation struggle and the OUN bear one and the same thing. It is a war struggle. There's no discussion of the Holodomor. Ukrainians are victims, but they don't victimize. And these are all illustrations that many people have assimilated because they know the graphic art of Khasevich. This is an image of Klim Savur, Dmytro Klyachkivsky, who probably made that decision to remove the Poles initially. But it's layered over with many other things. Stamps have been produced in the West in which the struggle is always for the OUN, the UPA, the struggle is always for defending the lands. Here's a stamp commemorating the tragedy in Khust, the Zakharov, the westernmost Ukrainian lands, now parts of Poland. Another stamp produced by the OUN Be organization in Britain, SUB, Союз Українців Великобританії. Again, it commemorates the struggle in western Ukrainian lands, in the Zakharov area. But it's everywhere. If you collect postcards, if you collect Christmas cards, if you collect Easter cards, you get the same image of the Ukrainian soldier in western lands. I mean, it's a heroic image, a glorified image. It becomes sacred. It's the soldier defending the land, the soldier that has to be supported by the community, that is supported by the community. It's a sacred struggle. If you look at the 60s, this goes from the 40s, 50s, 60s till today. Hordinsky's beautiful Christmas cards. It's always the fight. And the soldier becomes the defender of the nation. The Banderites, the OUN Be, the UPA get folded into this generalized image. It's very different from how other people see it. Take a look at this. On the right, you have a leaflet that is circulating in Poland today, basically showing the OUN Be as killers of pregnant women, small children. On the left, you have the glorified, this is from about 1940, the postcard glorifying the struggle for Carpatho Ukraine in 1938-39. Clash of memories. Now, if you go back into the myth system, I can possibly talk to you about all of the writers, all of the myths, but here's one, Leonid Mosenz. I'll just very briefly tell you a little bit about him. And it's unexpected. Here's a writer who became a Ukrainian. He wasn't a Ukrainian. He didn't think of himself as a Ukrainian. He thought of himself as a Russian. But he had one of these conversion experiences. He wasn't even ethnically Ukrainian. Like many of these people, and they write about this. Volodymyr Martinets writes, ironically, the whole leadership of the OUN, of all 11 people, only 2 of them were Ukrainians. The rest were mixed blood, mixed origin. So they make fun of this. He was from eastern Ukraine, as was almost all the leadership of OUN from 29 to 39. All those people living abroad, writing articles, most came from eastern Ukraine. He was partly Lithuanian, partly Polish, partly Ukrainian ancestry. He fought 18 to 20, worked for the UNR mission. He was interned by the Poles in 1922, contracted tuberculosis, which eventually killed him. And he writes books like Zasiv, which won the seeding, which won an award as the best book in Lviv in the 30s. It's about a young boy inspired by myths and legends. It's full of faith in this younger generation that's going to come along. And it believes in a spirit that catches fire. This inspired spirit will lead people to action. And he became a fanatical supporter of Hitler and of Dontsov until the war, the German-Soviet war started. When he saw what Dontsov running away from the war, first to Berlin and then to Sofia in Bulgaria, eventually made his way to Canada. When he saw what was happening, what the Germans were doing and what the nationalists were doing, he changed. So his final book, Ostatny Prorok, is really, he became more religious, more of a pacifist, or a man who retreated from armed struggle, violence. And it's a critique of zealotry. It's about zealots, the original zealots during the Christian, during Christ's time. It's an attack on all zealotry, all zealots. Very interesting book. You won't find that interpretation, though, in discussions in contemporary Ukraine of Leonid Mosen's, because it goes against the myth-making. Now, if you look at I'm just going to run through a few slides here showing you the kind of imagery that people in the 30s would come across, or 30s and later. Yaroslava Muzika, journal from 1932, another cover from a journal from 32. It's all about soldierly virtues, about strength and working for the cause. Also this idea of beating down the enemy dragon. That's Levitsky, a graphic. We have lots of St. George's, and we have the glorification of the soldier. Now, this wasn't just OUN. This was the spirit of the age. If you look at the literature that was being produced anywhere in Europe at the time, there was a trend towards strong men, tough people. But it was particularly noted in the OUN kind of writers. And this is a caricature of Dontsov, which actually appeared in the cover of Dontsov's Patriotism, 1936, done by Kozak, Edvard Kozak. But the non-OUN types were also interested in the past, the history, the myths. So you look through any of these journals, they're about Cossacks, people on horseback, ancient warriors, and they're about solidarity. Here's an invitation to a ball of students, 1922, in Berlin, Ukrainian students. You know, this idea of the collective, the group, the solidarity. A cover for the Hromada calendar. And now we go to today. Similar kind of myth-making, but it's very different in tone. You know, yeah, we have superheroes today. We need superheroes. I'm not saying that superheroes shouldn't exist. They have a reason for existing. But it's a different kind of superhero today. Shevchenko is Superman, but Shevchenko is also, what's that, Che Guevara? Right? Whoa, I can't see the OUN. you know, having Che Guevara as their Superman. You've got, you know, Delacroix's famous victory leading the charge, but you've also got the Jewish platoon, the Jewish corps in the struggle for over the Maidan. Very different kind of flavor to this. You've got an anarchistic flavor as well. Here, Mama Anarchia, Mother Anarchy, all produced during the Maidan. Makhno, Our Land, Voля abo smерть, Freedom or Death. And you've got, you know, the Darth Vader, evil Muscovite, and you've got, you know, the Luke Skywalker, is that? Skywalker, yeah. So, yes, people, especially during wartime, especially during the time of struggle, they tend to make religious icons out of warriors. And this is, you know, to be expected. But it's a very different flavor. It's a very different kind of operation. And the only thing that really links the present to the present struggle, well, not the only thing, but the main thing that links the present struggle to the 30s, I think, is, first of all, a desire for militancy, a desire to find people who were ready to fight for independence, people who were ready to take up arms. They need that tradition, they look for it, and they tend to find it in what they imagine to have been the OUN of the past. I'm going to conclude so that we can have a discussion. It's not a very satisfying conclusion, but because it's a complicated story, I think. But first of all, it's not a simple story. The OUN, the UPA, the radical right, was somewhere in between national liberation, sometimes collaboration. I often make the point to people who want to either demonize or glorify, dismiss this movement. I make the point, what if you were a young man in 1945, and as the Red Army, the Polish Army is liquidating your territory, throwing out, cleansing it of Ukrainians, you want to fight. You haven't participated in the Holocaust, you have not participated in the Volhynian cleansing, you take up arms because you want to fight a defensive struggle. This was the heroic era of the UPA. I have sympathy for these people, and I think you can't just simplify it to the point where you reject anybody who was part of it, nor can you glorify it entirely. There was an evolution in the politics and the ideology. If you read the ideology, if you look at the politics from 35, 39, 41, 43, 56, it's different. It changes. And you have to be able to integrate these different cultural memories into attempt to integrate it into an overall narrative. That's what's being done in other countries, in other traditions, in other discourses, where people are looking at the Second World War anew. I think it's very important to integrate personal experience of ordinary people, their evolution. And this is why literature for me became very interesting, because I saw how the personal experience shaped individuals. Cultural memory studies are important for me because how institutional memory changes needs study. The books we produce, the museums we organize, the art we produce reshapes our images of the past. It actually changes how we view the past. And there are bigger contexts that we need to be aware of constantly. This discussion in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian discourse, is taking place after the German historical strike discussion of the 1980s, long, very involved, very passionate discussion. The Wehrmacht, the discussion of the Wehrmacht exhibition of 95 and 2001, where people really complained that the exhibition of the Wehrmacht had whitewashed events. There was a long, interesting discussion there. The Polish discussion of Jan Grosser's book and comments on it. And of course, most importantly, the war taking place today between Russia and Ukraine, the whole post-Maidan context. That shapes what people are looking for, how they view the past, what they want to see in the past, how they reinterpret the past. I think that I'll have to stop there.